Clay Banker's final deposit wasn't in the vault. It was his life. Welcome to Shadow Code. I'm Thornwick. Tell me where you're watching. Your comments make this journey unforgettable. When a banker comes knocking at Wolfe's brownstone after midnight, you can bet he's not carrying flowers. The man standing on our doorstep that October evening was Harrison Pembroke, Senior Vice President of First Manhattan Trust, and judging by the way his hands shook as he fumbled with his briefcase, whatever had brought him to West 35th Street couldn't wait for banking hours. I'd been dozing in my chair in the office, feet up on my desk, when the doorbell's insistent chiming pulled me back to consciousness. Through the front window's sheer curtains, I could make out a figure hunched against the autumn wind, coat collar turned up, hat pulled low. Not the usual profile of our clientele, who tended toward the desperate housewife or the paranoid industrialist, but desperation has a universal posture, and this man wore it like a second skin. Mr. Goodwin? His voice carried the cultivated tones of old money and older privilege, but underneath ran a current of something raw and urgent. I must see Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's about murder. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. I'd heard it spoken 1,000 different ways over the years, whispered in confession, shouted in accusation, muttered in fear, but Pembroke delivered it with the precision of a man accustomed to weighing the exact value of everything he touched. Murder, his tone suggested, was simply another commodity to be appraised and handled with proper care. Mr. Wolfe doesn't see clients after 11, I told him, though we both knew I'd already decided to let him in. There's something about a banker claiming murder that piques the curiosity, even at midnight, and certainly not without an appointment. This can't wait for appointments. Pembroke stepped closer to the door, close enough that I could see the fine tremor in his jawline, the way his eyes kept darting to the shadows behind him. 3 hours ago, my closest friend put a bullet through his head. The police are calling it suicide, but I know better. Charles Rothmore didn't kill himself, Mr. Goodwin. He was murdered, and I have reason to believe I'm next. Now that got my attention. I swung the door wider and gestured him into the hall, noting the expensive cut of his overcoat, the Italian leather of his briefcase, the way he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent his life calculating risks and minimizing exposure. Everything about Harrison Pembroke screamed respectability, which in my experience usually meant he was hiding something spectacular. Wait here, I told him, then climbed the stairs to Wolfe's bedroom. The boss doesn't like being disturbed during his sleep any more than he likes being disturbed during his meals, his orchid sessions, or his reading time. But a banker with a murder story and money to burn tends to override even Nero Wolfe's legendary inflexibility. I found him sitting up in bed, a biography of Brillat-Savarin propped on his considerable belly, his massive form barely contained by silk pajamas that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His eyes, sharp and dark as espresso beans, fixed on me with the patient resignation of a man who'd accepted long ago that his sleep would forever be at the mercy of other people's crises. A banker, Archie, at this hour. Harrison Pembroke, first. Manhattan Trust. Says his friend was murdered tonight, made to look like suicide. Thinks he might be next on the list. Wolfe sighed, the sound like air escaping from a punctured tire. Money? Plenty, judging by the threads, and scared enough to come knocking after midnight. Very well. Give me 15 minutes, then bring him to the office. I returned to find Pembroke pacing the hall like a caged animal, his briefcase clutched against his chest like armor. The man was wound tighter than a $2 watch, and I had the distinct impression that whatever story he'd come to tell, we were only going to hear the parts he wanted us to hear. When I ushered him into the office 20 minutes later, Wolfe had assumed his usual position behind the massive desk, resplendent in a yellow silk shirt that made him look like a well-fed canary. He gestured to the red leather chair reserved for clients, and Pembroke settled into it with the careful movements of a man testing thin ice. Mr. Pembroke, Archie tells me you have concerns about a friend's death. Charles Rothmore. Pembroke's voice caught slightly on the name. We've been friends for 30 years, business partners for 20. 3 hours ago the police found him in his study with a bullet in his head and his service revolver in his hand. They're calling it suicide, but Charles would never... He stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. Charles Rothmore was the most methodical man I've ever known. If he'd wanted to kill himself, he'd have left a note. He'd have put his affairs in order. He'd have done it properly. Wolfe finished. Yes, I understand. Men of business rarely leave loose ends. Even in death. What makes you believe his murder connects to you? Pembroke opened his briefcase with hands that shook only slightly, extracting a manila folder thick with documents. 3 weeks ago, Charles came to me with concerns about irregularities in our trust accounts, large sums moving through dormant, accounts transfers that didn't match our records, deposits that appeared and disappeared without proper documentation. We'd been investigating quietly, trying to determine the scope of the problem before involving the authorities. Embezzlement? We thought so initially, but the pattern was too sophisticated, too carefully orchestrated. Someone wasn't just stealing money, they were laundering it. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly millions, flowing through our bank using the accounts of clients who'd been dead for years. I leaned forward in my chair, notebook ready. Money laundering was serious business, the kind that attracted serious people with serious solutions to anyone who got too curious. You have proof of this? Charles had the primary documentation. I was handling the analysis of transaction patterns. Pembroke's laugh held no humor. He insisted on keeping the sensitive materials at his home, said he didn't trust anyone at the bank. Apparently he was right not to. Wolfe's fingers drummed against the desk's leather surface, a sure sign his considerable brain was already dissecting the problem. These dormant accounts, how long deceased were their original owners? Some as long as 15 years, accounts that should have been closed and their assets distributed to heirs, but somehow remained active in our system. Small amounts at first, just enough to keep them from triggering automatic reviews, but the activity increased dramatically over the past 6 months. And tonight, 3 hours after your friend's death, you believe yourself to be in danger. Why? Pembroke reached into his coat and withdrew a white envelope, his name typed across the front in block letters. This was slipped under my door 2 hours ago. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a message that managed to be both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. Mr. Pembroke, your continued investigation into matters that don't concern you has been noted. Consider Mr. Rothmore's fate AIT professional courtesy. Discontinue your inquiries immediately or face similar consequences. This is your only warning. The paper was expensive, the typing perfect, the tone businesslike. Someone had taken time to craft a threat that read like a corporate memo, which somehow made it more chilling than any crude scrawl could have been. Professional courtesy, Wolfe murmured. An interesting phrase. It suggests your friend's killer operates within your world, understands its customs and courtesies. That's what frightens me most. Pembroke's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. This isn't some street criminal who got lucky. Whoever killed Charles moves in our circles, knows our procedures, has access to our systems. They could be anyone, a colleague, a client, even a board member. I made notes while Wolfe continued his questioning, building the framework of what looked to be a deliciously complex case. Banking fraud with murder complications was right in our wheelhouse, the kind of sophisticated puzzle that got Wolfe's intellectual motor purring like a well-tuned engine. Your fee, Mr. Wolfe. $10,000 plus expenses, half in advance. Pembroke didn't even blink. He extracted a checkbook from his briefcase and wrote out the amount without hesitation, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the room. Money, I reflected, really did talk, and in this case it was practically shouting. What do you need from me? Access to your bank's records, naturally. A list of everyone who knew about your investigation, details about your friend's personal life, enemies, recent concerns, any changes in behavior. Wolfe paused, considering. And most importantly, those transaction records your friend compiled. I assume they weren't destroyed in tonight's unfortunate incident. Charles was too careful for that. He kept copies of everything in a safety deposit box at Central Manhattan Bank. I have a key. We were joint signatories for security purposes. Pembroke handed over a small silver key. But I warn you, Mr. Wolfe, whoever we're dealing with has already demonstrated their willingness to kill. I won't have your death on my conscience. My conscience will survive the risk, Wolfe replied, dryly. Archie will drive you home, and tomorrow we begin our investigation in earnest. I suggest you vary your routines and avoid being alone whenever possible. After I deposited Pembroke safely at his Upper East Side apartment and returned to the brownstone, I found Wolfe still in the office, studying the threatening note with the concentration of a jeweler examining a particularly fine diamond. What do you think? I asked. I think, Archie, that we're dealing with someone who understands the value of psychological warfare. This note accomplishes two objectives. It warns our client away from further investigation, and it drives him directly to us. Someone wants Nero Wolfe involved in this case. That's a cheerful thought. Any idea why? Several possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. Perhaps they believe my reputation will discourage deeper investigation by the authorities. Perhaps they want a scapegoat for their crimes, or perhaps— He paused, his dark eyes thoughtful. Perhaps they simply enjoy the challenge of matching wits with someone of my capabilities. A thrill killer with a Harvard MBA? Something like that, yes. Wolfe set down the note and reached for his book. In any case, we'll know more tomorrow. Arrange for us to visit the bank at 10 o'clock and contact Saul. I suspect we'll need his particular talents before this matter resolves itself. I headed upstairs, but sleep came fitfully. Something about this case felt different, more personal somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the calculated precision of that threatening note, or the way Pembroke's hands had shaken, despite his obvious efforts to appear calm. Or maybe it was just the nagging sensation that we were walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple case of banking fraud. I should have trusted that instinct. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October drizzle that turns Manhattan's streets into a study in black and white. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when Fritz announced that Inspector Kramer was at the front door, requesting an immediate audience with Mr. Wolfe. Kramer looked like he'd been up all night, his usually rumpled appearance elevated to new heights of dishevelment. His coat dripped steadily on Fritz's clean floor, and his expression suggested someone had been using his face for batting practice. "Where's Wolfe?" he demanded without preamble. "Upstairs with his orchids. He'll be down at 11. Get him down. Now we need to talk about Harrison Pembroke." That got my attention. "What about him?" "What about him?" Kramer's laugh sounded like a rusty gate creaking. "How about the fact that he was found dead in his apartment this morning, shot through the head with his own gun? How about the fact that the doorman says you dropped him off there around 2 a.m.? How about the fact that we found a check made out to Nero Wolfe for $5,000 in his desk drawer?" The news hit me like a physical blow. Pembroke, alive and terrified just 8 hours ago, was now another corpse in what was shaping up to be a very deadly pattern. When? Sometime between 3 and 6 this morning, according to the preliminary examination. Same setup as his friend. Rothmore, gun in the hand, no signs of struggle, everything neat and tidy as a banker's ledger. Kramer's eyes narrowed. Except this time, we've got a witness who saw 2 men leaving the building around 4 a.m. Want to guess what they looked like? Tall and short. Funny, Goodwin, real funny. One average height, well-dressed, moving like he knew where he was going. The other, shorter, stockier, following behind. Ring any bells? It rang plenty of bells, most of them sounding alarm. Someone was working very hard to implicate Wolfe and me in a double murder, which meant our mysterious opponent had moved from psychological warfare to direct attack. The game, as they say, was afoot. You want to tell me what Pembroke hired you for? I considered my options, which mainly involved truth or creative interpretation thereof. He claimed someone murdered his friend Rothmore, made it look like suicide. Said he was next on the list. Turns out he was right about that part. Kramer settled into the client chair, his bulk making the leather creak ominously. What he didn't tell you was that both men were under investigation by the Federal Banking Commission for suspected money laundering, or that Rothmore had been skimming from trust accounts for the past 3 years, or that Pembroke himself was neck-deep in the whole operation. That put a different spin on things. You're saying they were partners in crime. I'm saying they were both dirty, and someone decided to clean house. Question is, who hired the maid service? Kramer's gaze was steady, measuring, and whether your boss knew more about his client than he let on? Wolfe doesn't take cases blind. If Pembroke was dirty, then either Wolfe didn't do his homework, or he was getting paid to look the other way. Kramer stood, brushing imaginary lint from his coat. Either way, I want to see him, now. I climbed the stairs to the plant rooms, where I found Wolfe examining a particularly spectacular Cattleya orchid, his face serene as a Buddha contemplating the nature of existence. The humid air was thick with the scent of growing things and the soft sound of water dripping from the misting system. Kramer's here, Pembroke's dead, and he thinks we killed him. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant his brain had shifted into high gear. When? This morning, between 3 and 6. Same setup as Rothmore. Gun, no struggle, very neat and professional. I gave him the rest of Kramer's information, watching his face for tells. Seems our client wasn't quite as innocent as he claimed. No, Wolfe murmured, still studying the orchid. I rather suspected he wasn't. Men don't usually receive death threats for investigating crimes they're not involved in. He set down his magnifying glass and turned to face me. Nevertheless, he hired us to find his friend's killer, and someone murdered him before we could complete that task. I find that personally insulting. So we're staying on the case. Oh yes, with considerable enthusiasm. Wolfe's smile was cold as February. Someone has gone to great trouble to paint us as murderers, Archie. I intend to discover who and why, and then I intend to make them regret their presumption. We found Kramer pacing the office like a caged tiger, his patience clearly wearing thin. Wolfe settled behind his desk with the deliberate movements of a man preparing for battle. Inspector, I understand you have questions about our late client. I've got more than questions, Wolfe. I've got 2 dead bankers, a money laundering scheme, and witnesses who put you and Goodwin at the scene. Unless you've got some very good answers, this conversation's going to continue downtown. I have several excellent answers, Wolfe replied calmly. First, Mr. Pembroke consulted us because he believed his friend had been murdered. Second, his fear for his own safety proved tragically accurate. Third, whoever killed them both has made the serious error of attempting to implicate me in their crimes. So you admit Pembroke hired you? Certainly. He paid me $5,000 to investigate Charles Rothmore's death and protect him from a similar fate. I failed in the latter objective, which I find personally embarrassing. Kramer's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. You're admitting professional failure? That's not like you, Wolfe. It's not professional failure, Inspector. It's professional challenge. Someone murdered my client to prevent him from pursuing an investigation I had undertaken. That makes his death my responsibility. And you expect me to believe you didn't know about the money laundering? I suspected it naturally. Men rarely receive death threats for investigating crimes they haven't committed. But Mr. Pembroke's criminal activities, while morally reprehensible, don't invalidate his right to my protection. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Besides, I find myself curious about the party responsible for this elaborate frame-up. Frame-up? Kramer snorted. You think someone's trying to pin this on you? Consider the evidence, Inspector. 2 bankers involved in money laundering are murdered within hours of each other. One hires me, ostensibly for protection, then dies, before I can provide it. Witnesses conveniently spot 2 men matching our general description leaving the scene, and we find ourselves the primary suspects in a double homicide. Wolfe's smile was thin. Either we're dealing with the most incompetent murderers in Manhattan, or someone wants very badly for you to arrest us. I had to admit, laid out like that, it did sound suspicious. Too convenient by half, like someone had been reading detective novels for plotting tips. What makes you think it's a frame? Several factors. First, if I had intended to murder Mr. Pembroke, I would hardly have done so immediately after accepting his retainer. Second, I would certainly not have been so sloppy as to leave witnesses. Third, and most importantly, I had no motive for his death. Quite the contrary. He was paying me to keep him alive. Kramer considered this, his bulldog face creased in thought. So, who did have motive? An excellent question. Someone who knew about the money laundering investigation, who had access to both men, and who possessed the skill to make murders appear as suicides. Someone who wanted them silenced permanently, but was concerned enough about my involvement to attempt deflecting suspicion onto me. Any candidates? Several. Once I've had opportunity to examine the evidence more thoroughly. Wolfe gestured toward the manila folder Pembroke had left behind. With your permission, Inspector, I'd like to continue the investigation Mr. Pembroke hired me to conduct. You want me to let you investigate your own client's murder. I want you to let me find the person who's made me an accessory to murder. By proxy. Someone killed Harrison Pembroke to prevent him from completing an investigation I had undertaken. That makes his death my failure, and I don't care to leave failures unresolved. Kramer stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. 24 hours, Wolfe. You find me something concrete in 24 hours, or I'm bringing both of you in for questioning. After Kramer left, I poured myself a beer and settled in for some serious thinking. 2 bankers dead, both involved in money laundering, both killed by someone professional enough to make murder look like suicide. Our client scared enough to hire protection, then dead before we could provide it. And someone working overtime to make sure the blame landed squarely on our doorstep. It's personal, I said finally. Wolfe looked up from the documents Pembroke had left. Explain. This whole setup, it's too elaborate just to cover up financial crimes. Someone went to a lot of trouble to get us involved, then make sure we looked guilty. That takes time, planning, resources. You don't go to that kind of effort unless you've got a personal stake in the outcome. An interesting theory. What sort of personal stake? Maybe someone with a grudge against you. Or maybe someone who needs a very public scapegoat to distract attention from the real crime. I took a long pull of beer, thinking it through. What if the money laundering is just the surface layer? What if there's something bigger underneath, something worth killing for? Such as? That's the question, isn't it? I gestured toward the folder. What's in Pembroke's documentation? Wolfe had been studying the contents while we talked, his expression growing increasingly grim. Transaction records for 17 dormant. Accounts dating back 15 years. Conservative estimate of laundered funds $12 million. I whistled softly. $12 million was serious money, the kind that attracted serious people with serious methods of protecting their interests. But here's what's interesting, Archie. The pattern suggests this wasn't random embezzlement. Someone selected these. Specific accounts for specific reasons. Look at the dates. I examined the records over his shoulder. The accounts had been opened by people with names like Morrison, Kellerman, Rothstein, and Delacroix, names that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant something to someone. The dates of death ranged from 1935 to 1948, with most clustering around the war years. What am I missing? Research these names, Archie. Find out who these people were, how they died, what they had in common. I suspect we'll discover that our money laundering scheme is connected to something much older and more significant than simple banking fraud. You think this goes back to the war? I think someone has been very carefully, very systematically stealing from the dead for over a decade. And I think Charles Rothmore and Harrison Pembroke discovered something about that theft that was worth killing them to keep secret. I spent the rest of the morning at the public library, tracking down obituaries and public records for the names on Pembroke's list. What I found sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. Morrison, Jewish refugee from Germany, died 1943, no known survivors. Kellerman, Polish immigrant, died 1944, family killed in the war. Rothstein, Austrian, refugee, died 1946, survived by a brother who died later that year. Delacroix, French resistance member, died 1947, no surviving family. The pattern became clear after the first few names. These weren't random bank customers. They were war refugees, people who'd fled Europe with what wealth they could carry, people whose families had been scattered or destroyed by the war, people who'd deposited their life savings in American banks for safety, then died without heirs to claim their assets. Someone had been systematically looting accounts belonging to Holocaust survivors and war refugees, stealing money from people who'd already lost everything else. It was a crime so callous, so morally bankrupt, that it took my breath away. But it was also a crime that would ruin more than just the perpetrator if it came to light. How a scandal like this could bring down an entire bank, destroy dozens of careers, trigger investigations that would reach into the highest levels of Manhattan's financial establishment, that was motive enough for multiple murders. I returned to the brownstone to find Wolfe in the office with Saul Panzer, our best freelance operative, and the man I'd trust with my life if the chips were down. Saul's narrow face was thoughtful as he studied a photograph, his quick brown eyes missing nothing. "Archie," Wolfe greeted me. "What did you discover?" I gave them my findings, watching their faces grow progressively grimmer as the scope of the crime became clear. When I finished, Saul set down the photograph and shook his head slowly. $12 million stolen from Holocaust survivors, he said quietly. "That's not just criminal, it's evil." "What's the photograph?" I asked. Saul handed it over. It showed a group of men in expensive suits standing around a conference table, apparently taken at some sort of banking function. Board of Directors of First Manhattan Trust, taken last month at their annual dinner. Pembroke gave it to Wolfe last night, said he thought one of these men might be involved. I studied the faces. 12 distinguished gentlemen representing old money, older families, and the kind of social connections that could make or break careers with a phone call. They looked like pillars of the community, which in my experience usually meant they were holding up something that deserved to fall down. "Anyone stand out?" "Several possibilities," Wolfe replied, "but I'm particularly interested in this gentleman. Here." He tapped a figure on the right side of the photograph, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that belonged on currency. "Jonathan Hartwell, chairman of the board. He's been with First Manhattan Trust for 35 years, had access to all the accounts in question, and would certainly have the influence to cover up irregularities. He's also got political connections that reach all the way to Washington," Saul added. "The kind of man who could make investigations disappear if they got too close to home, or the kind of man who could arrange for inconvenient witnesses to have fatal accidents," I said. "Where is he now?" "That's what Saul is going to find out," Wolfe replied, "along with his financial status, his personal habits, and his whereabouts last night when our client was murdered." "What about me?" You're going to visit the scene of Rothmore's death. The police may have missed something, and I want to understand exactly how our killer operates. Charles Rothmore's house was a tasteful brownstone on East 72nd Street, the kind of place that whispered old money and older secrets. The police had finished their investigation and released the scene, leaving me free to poke around without official interference. The study where Rothmore had died was a shrine to conservative respectability. Leather-bound books, Persian rugs, oil paintings of dead industrialists gazing down with expressions of financial superiority. Everything was in perfect order, except for the chalk outline on the carpet and the dark stain where blood had seeped into expensive wool. I spent an hour going through the room systematically, looking for anything the police might have overlooked. What I found was subtle but significant. Tiny scratches on the window lock, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Someone had forced the window from outside, re-locked it afterward, and done such a careful job that it had fooled our initial investigation. The positioning of the body bothered me too. Rothmore had supposedly shot himself while sitting at his desk, but the blood spatter patterns suggested he'd been standing near the window when the shot was fired. Someone had moved the body afterward, arranged it to look like a suicide, and done a professional job of staging the scene. I was photographing the window scratches when I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. I turned to find a woman watching me from the doorway. Mid-40s, elegant, in the way that only comes from generations of good breeding, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of bone structure that would look distinguished at 90. "You're not a policeman," she said, and her voice carried the same cultivated tones as Pembroke's. "Archie Goodwin, private investigator. And you are?" "Margaret Rothmore. Charles was my husband." She stepped into the room, her eyes avoiding the bloodstain on the carpet. "I heard someone moving around down here and thought perhaps the police had returned. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Rothmore. I'm investigating your husband's death on behalf of Harrison Pembroke." Her face went very still. "Harrison is dead too." "I'm afraid so. Shot last night, same circumstances as your husband." She absorbed this information with the stoic composure of someone who'd been expecting bad news. "Then they're both gone." She said quietly, "I told Charles this would happen. I told him he was playing with fire." "What do you mean?" Margaret Rothmore looked around the study one last time, then gestured toward the hallway. "Not here. Too many ghosts. We'll talk in the kitchen." Over coffee in a kitchen that belonged in better homes and gardens, she told me a story that made the case considerably more complicated. Her husband hadn't stumbled across the money laundering scheme by accident. He'd been investigating it for months at the request of someone who'd been tracking stolen assets from war refugees. "A man named David Stern approached Charles last spring," she said, warming her hands on her coffee cup. "His organization helped survivors locate assets that were stolen or lost during the war. He'd traced several accounts to First Manhattan Trust, accounts that should have been distributed to surviving family members but had remained active. What kind of organization? Something called the Holocaust Asset Recovery Foundation. Mr. Stern was very passionate about recovering stolen wealth, returning it to rightful heirs or to organizations helping other survivors." She paused, sipping her coffee. Charles was moved by his story. He agreed to help investigate quietly, see if there were other accounts that had been mishandled. And that's when he discovered the money laundering? That's when he discovered that someone was systematically looting accounts belonging to people who died without heirs, not just mismanaging them, actively stealing from them, using the money for purposes Charles wouldn't tell me about. Her voice hardened. Whoever was responsible had turned the suffering of Holocaust victims into their personal bank account. Did your husband have any idea who was behind it? He suspected someone very high up in the bank's hierarchy. Someone There with access to all the records, someone who'd been there long enough to cover their tracks. She set down her cup, her hands steady despite what she'd been through. The night he died, Charles was agitated about something. He'd received a phone call that afternoon that upset him greatly. He wouldn't tell me what it was about, but he kept saying someone was going to pay for what they'd done. Did he mention any names? Only one. He said Jonathan Hartwell would regret the day he decided to steal from the dead. That was the confirmation I needed. I thanked Margaret Rothmore and headed back to the brownstone, my mind racing with the implications of what she'd told me. If Charles Rothmore had been working with a Holocaust asset recovery organization, his investigation wasn't just about banking fraud. It was about justice for people who'd already suffered more than anyone should have to endure. I found Wolfe in the office with another visitor, a man I didn't recognize but whose intensity was evident, even from across the room. He was thin, perhaps 60, with dark eyes that held the kind of depth that comes from seeing too much history firsthand. "Archie, this is David Stern, from the Holocaust Asset Recovery Foundation. He was working with Charles Rothmore on the investigation. That got both Rothmore and Pembroke killed." Stern rose to shake my hand, and I noticed the numbers tattooed on his forearm. A concentration camp survivor whose personal history gave weight to his mission. "Mr. Goodwin, I understand you're investigating Charles's murder. I want you to know that his work was saving lives, not just recovering money. Every dollar we return to survivors or their families makes a difference. Medical care, education for children, a chance to rebuild what was destroyed." "How long had you been working together?" 8 months. Charles contacted me after reading about our organization in a newspaper article. He'd noticed irregularities in several accounts and wanted to help make things right. Stern's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "He was a good man, Mr. Goodwin. He didn't have to get involved, but he couldn't stand by while thieves profited from genocide." "What did you discover?" 17 accounts belonging to Holocaust survivors and war refugees, totaling nearly $12 million, all of them dormant for years, but with regular activity suggesting someone was using them to launder money. Stern handed me a thick folder. Names, dates, transaction records, everything Charles was able to copy before his death. I skimmed, the documents noting names I recognized from my library research. Any idea who was responsible? Charles suspected Jonathan Hartwell, but we couldn't prove it. Hartwell had access to all the necessary records. He'd been at the bank long enough to know which accounts were truly dormant, and he had the authority to prevent questions from being asked. Stern's expression darkened. What we couldn't understand was why he'd risk everything for money he already had. Maybe it wasn't about the money, I suggested. Maybe it was about the power, or the thrill, or just the knowledge that he could get away with it. Perhaps. But there's something else you should know. Stern reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single sheet of paper. 3 days ago, Charles received this. It was a photocopy of a document that made my blood run cold, a letter dated 1943, written in German, with an English translation clipped to the corner. The letter was from a man named Isaac Kellerman to his brother in New York, describing conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto and begging for help getting his family to America. The brother had apparently succeeded in arranging passage, but the family had died en route. Isaac Kellerman, I said, recognizing the name from the dormant account list. Yes, but look at the signature on the translation. Stern pointed to the bottom of the page, where someone had signed their name in English, J. Hartwell, translator. Hartwell translated this letter. In 1943, he was working for a refugee assistance organization, helping process immigration paperwork for people fleeing Europe. He had access to all their financial records, knew which families had brought wealth to America, knew which ones had died without heirs to claim their assets. The scope of the crime was staggering. Hartwell hadn't just stolen from random accounts, he'd been systematically targeting refugees whose tragic stories he'd known firsthand. He'd used his position helping Holocaust survivors to identify and rob them, turning their trust into his profit. "We need to talk to Hartwell," I said. "That may prove difficult," Wolfe replied grimly. "According to Saul's report, Mr. Hartwell left the country this morning on a private flight to Switzerland. Apparently he had urgent business that couldn't—" "Wait, Switzerland. Land of numbered bank accounts and questions that never got asked. If Hartwell had fled there with $12 million in stolen assets, getting him back would require more legal muscle than we possessed." "How convenient," I muttered. "Any chance this is coincidence?" "About as much chance as snow in July," Stern said bitterly. "The man spent decades building a reputation as a pillar of the community while systematically robbing genocide survivors. Running away is perfectly consistent with his character." Wolfe drummed his fingers on the desk, a sure sign his brain was working overtime. "Mr. Stern, in your experience with asset recovery, how difficult would it be to trace funds that have been transferred to Swiss accounts?" "Nearly impossible without cooperation from Swiss authorities, which we're unlikely to get. Swiss banking laws are designed specifically to prevent that kind of investigation." Stern's shoulders slumped. "If Hartwell's moved the money there, it's effectively gone forever." "Perhaps," Wolfe said thoughtfully. "But men like Hartwell rarely act alone in schemes of this complexity. Someone at the bank had to help him access those accounts, falsify records, prevent audits from revealing the irregularities. Someone who's still here, still vulnerable." "You think he had a partner?" "I think he had an entire network. Rothmore and Pembroke were killed because they'd gotten too close to exposing not just Hartwell, but everyone who helped him." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, I want you to visit First Manhattan Trust tomorrow morning. Tell them you're investigating Pembroke's death on behalf of his family, and you need to examine his office and personal effects. Looking for anything in particular? Evidence of his communications with other bank employees. If Pembroke was investigating the money laundering, he would have been watching his colleagues carefully. Looking for signs of complicity. He may have documented his suspicions. And if I find something, then we'll know who to press for information." About Hartwell's escape route, Wolfe's smile was cold. "Men who profit from genocide may be evil, but they're rarely stupid. Hartwell wouldn't have fled without ensuring his partner's continued silence. That suggests leverage, which suggests vulnerability." Stern left with promises to stay in touch, and I spent the evening reviewing everything we knew about the case. 2 bankers dead, both involved in investigating a massive theft from Holocaust survivors. The primary suspect fled to Switzerland with the stolen assets. Someone had gone to elaborate lengths to frame Wolfe and me for the murders, suggesting a conspiracy that reached beyond simple financial fraud. The pattern suggested someone with resources, connections, and a desperate need to prevent the truth from coming out. Someone who saw Wolfe's involvement as enough of a threat to risk implicating him in murder. The next morning brought another grey October day and a phone call that changed everything. I was finishing my coffee when Fritz announced that Inspector Kramer was on the line, and his tone suggested the news wasn't good. "Goodwin, we found Jonathan Hartwell." "Where?" "Floating in the Hudson River with a bullet in his head. Been dead at least 12 hours, probably more." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Our primary suspect was now another corpse, which meant either we'd been completely wrong about his guilt, or someone was cleaning house with professional thoroughness. Same killer. Professional job, small caliber pistol, no witnesses, no physical evidence. But here's the interesting part. Hartwell never left the country. That flight to Switzerland took off without him. Someone wanted us to think he'd run. 2. Buy time for the real killer to tie up loose ends. That's my theory, and right now you and Wolfe are still my best suspects for all 3 murders. Come on, Kramer. You know we didn't kill Hartwell. Do I? You had motive. He was your prime suspect. You had opportunity. Nobody can account for your whereabouts last night after 10 p.m. And you certainly had the skills to make it look professional. Had a point, much as I hated to admit it. Someone was doing an excellent job of making us look guilty, which suggested they knew us well enough to predict our movements and methods. 24 hours, Kramer. 12. Find me something concrete. By tonight, or I'm bringing both of you in. I hung up and climbed the stairs to give Wolfe the bad news. I found him in the plant rooms, examining a spectacular yellow orchid with the concentration of a man trying to find meaning in beauty while surrounded by ugliness. Hartwell's dead. Pulled out of the Hudson this morning, shot in the head. Wolfe's hand stilled on the orchid stem. When? At least 12 hours ago. That flight to Switzerland was a red herring. Someone wanted us to think he'd escaped while they killed him. Interesting. That suggests our killer is more sophisticated than I initially estimated. Wolfe set down his magnifying glass and turned to face me. It also suggests Hartwell wasn't the primary perpetrator, merely another pawn to be discarded when he became inconvenient. So, who is the primary perpetrator? Someone with access to the bank's records, knowledge of our investigation, and the resources to stage an elaborate deception involving private flights and false alibis. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. Someone who's been watching us very carefully, predicting our moves, staying one step ahead. Someone who knows us personally, or someone who's made it their business to study us thoroughly. Wolfe headed toward the stairs. Come, Archie. I think it's time we visited First Manhattan Trust and asked some very direct questions. The bank was a monument to financial respectability, all marble columns and brass fittings, designed to inspire confidence in the institution's permanence. The lobby bustled with the usual crowd of customers conducting their usual business, blissfully unaware that their trusted bank had been used to launder millions in stolen assets. We were met by a nervous-looking assistant manager named Peterson, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his life under fluorescent lights. He led us through a maze of corridors to Pembroke's office, a corner space that reflected its occupant's senior position. Terrible business, Peterson muttered, unlocking the door. First Mr. Rothmore, then Mr. Pembroke, now Mr. Hartwell. The board is beside itself. I imagine they are, Wolfe replied dryly. Who's handling Mr. Hartwell's responsibilities in his absence? Mrs. Caldwell has been appointed interim chairman. She's been with the bank almost as long as Mr. Hartwell knows the business inside and out. And where might we find Mrs. Caldwell? She's in meetings most of the day, board emergency session, you understand. The bank's reputation is at stake. I'll bet it was. 3 dead executives and a money laundering scandal would make anyone nervous about their reputation. But something about Peterson's manner suggested more than ordinary corporate concern. Pembroke's office was a study in organized efficiency, everything in its place and properly labeled. His desk was clear except for a leather-bound appointment book and a crystal paperweight that probably cost more than most people's cars. I started with the desk drawers while Wolfe examined the bookshelves. Archie. Wolfe was standing beside a filing cabinet, holding a manila folder labeled Personal Confidential. Inside were photocopies of bank documents, transaction records, and what looked like surveillance reports on various bank employees. He was investigating his own colleagues, I said, scanning the contents. More than that. He was documenting a conspiracy. Wolfe handed me a typed memo dated 2 weeks ago. Read this. The memo was addressed to Charles Rothmore and marked Eyes Only. In it, Pembroke detailed his suspicions about the money laundering operation, but his conclusions were startling. According to his investigation, Jonathan Hartwell wasn't the mastermind. He was being blackmailed into cooperation. Hartwell discovered the thefts 6 months ago, Wolfe summarized, reading over my shoulder. But instead of reporting them, he was coerced into silence by someone who had evidence of his wartime activities with the Refugee Assistance Organization, someone who knew about his access to Holocaust survivor records and threatened to expose him as a collaborator unless he helped cover up the money laundering. So Hartwell was a victim too. A victim who became an accomplice to save his reputation. Not admirable, but understandable. Wolfe flipped through more documents. But here's what's truly interesting. Pembroke identified the real mastermind. He handed me another memo, this one containing a single name that made everything fall into place. Eleanor Caldwell. The interim chairman, I said, who's been with the bank almost as long as Hartwell, had access to all the same records and was in the perfect position to identify vulnerable accounts. Wolfe's expression was grim. And who's now in charge of damage control, perfectly positioned to destroy evidence and silence witnesses? Including us? Especially us. Mrs. Caldwell couldn't have anticipated that Pembroke would hire me, but once he did, she had to find a way to neutralize the threat. What better way than to make us suspects in the murders she was planning to commit anyway? It made sense in a horrible, elegant way. Caldwell kills Rothmore, then uses his death to panic Pembroke into hiring protection. She kills Pembroke, making it look like we failed to protect him. She kills Hartwell to eliminate the one person who could expose her, then frames us for all three murders. Clean, efficient, and very nearly foolproof. We need to find her, I said. I suspect she'll find us first. She can't afford to let us live now that we know the truth. Wolfe headed toward the door. But first, we need to ensure our own survival long enough to expose her. We were halfway across the lobby when Peterson caught up with us, his face flushed with exertion and something that might have been fear. Mr. Wolfe, Mrs. Caldwell would like to see you in her office. She said it was urgent. How convenient, Wolfe murmured. Lead the way, Mr. Peterson. Eleanor Caldwell's office occupied the entire top floor of the building, with windows that offered spectacular views of Manhattan and furnishings that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. The woman herself was impressive in a different way, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She looked like someone's favorite grandmother, if their grandmother happened to be worth $50 million. Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin, thank you for coming up. Her voice was warm, cultured, completely without menace. I understand you've been investigating the tragic deaths of our colleagues. Among other things, Wolfe replied carefully. I hope you'll understand that the bank's position is somewhat delicate. 3 executives dead in 3 days, rumors of financial irregularities. It's the sort of thing that can destroy an institution's reputation overnight. I imagine it is. She gestured toward a seating area near the windows, where coffee had been arranged on a silver service that belonged in a museum. I was hoping we might reach an understanding. What sort of understanding? The sort that recognizes mutual benefit. Your investigation has uncovered some uncomfortable truths about irregularities in our trust department. Rather than pursue those truths to their logical conclusion, which would inevitably result in a scandal that would destroy the bank and harm thousands of innocent employees and customers, perhaps we could find a more constructive approach. You're suggesting we suppress evidence of criminal activity. I'm suggesting we consider the greater good. The money that was misappropriated came from accounts belonging to people who are long dead, with no surviving heirs to benefit from its recovery. Meanwhile, this bank employs 800 people, serves thousands of customers, and contributes significantly to the city's economy, which serves the greater good, destroying all of that to recover money that can't be returned to its rightful owners, or finding a way to make amends without causing unnecessary destruction. It was a compelling argument, the kind that appealed to practical minds and pragmatic solutions. It was also exactly what someone would say if they were trying to buy time while planning multiple murders. What sort of amends did you have in mind? Wolfe asked. A substantial donation to Holocaust survivor organizations funded through the bank's charitable foundation. Full restoration of the misappropriated funds to accounts managed by reputable organizations dedicated to helping survivors. And a generous compensation for your time and discretion. How generous. $1 million, Mr. Wolfe, paid immediately with no questions asked and no strings attached. I nearly choked on my coffee. $1 million was serious money, enough to fund Wolfe's orchid collection for the next century. It was also exactly the sort of offer that would be impossible to refuse if you weren't absolutely certain it came with a death sentence attached. For you're very generous, Mrs. Caldwell. I prefer to think of it as practical. Mr. Rothmore and Mr. Pembroke were good men who got caught up in something larger than they understood. Their deaths were tragic, but dwelling on tragedy won't bring them back. We have an opportunity to turn their sacrifice into something positive, something that helps the very people the original theft harmed. And Jonathan Hartwell? For just a moment, something flickered behind her grandmother's eyes, something cold and calculating that gave the lie to her warm exterior. Mr. Hartwell was a troubled man who made some unfortunate choices. His death was regrettable, but not entirely surprising. You killed him, I said quietly. I beg your pardon. You killed all three of them. Rothmore because he was getting too close to the truth. Pembroke because he wouldn't stop investigating. Hartwell because he was the only one who could identify you as the real mastermind. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but she reached for her purse with movements that were a little too casual, a little too deliberate. Mr. Goodwin, I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. Am I? You had access to all the accounts. You knew which ones belonged to Holocaust survivors with no living heirs, and you've been systematically looting them for years. When Rothmore started investigating, you couldn't just kill him. That would have drawn too much attention, so you made it look like suicide, then used his death to panic Pembroke into hiring protection. That's quite a theory. It gets better. You knew Pembroke would probably come to us. We have a reputation for protecting clients who can afford our fees. So you killed him too, making it look like we failed in our job. Then you killed Hartwell and set up an elaborate escape scenario to make it look like he was the guilty party running away with the stolen money. Caldwell's hand was definitely in her purse now, and I was willing to bet she wasn't looking for lipstick. Even if that were true, which it's not, what would you propose to do about it? Expose you, Wolfe said simply. The police are already suspicious of your story, Mrs. Caldwell. When they examine the evidence more carefully, and they will, they'll discover the same things we did. Your access to the accounts, your knowledge of Holocaust survivor records, your ability to falsify documents and arrange alibis. You're forgetting one important detail, Mr. Wolfe. Caldwell's hand emerged from her purse, holding a small silver pistol, the kind of elegant weapon that matched her refined exterior. Dead men tell no tales, and neither do their assistants. You're planning to shoot us in your office? That seems rather public for someone who's worked so hard to make murders look like suicides. I'm planning to defend myself against two dangerous criminals who came here to blackmail me, then attacked me when I refused their demands. Tragic, really. Two men with such distinguished careers, driven to desperate measures by financial desperation. It was a good plan, I had to admit. Caldwell had position, reputation, and enough circumstantial evidence against us to make self-defense credible. She'd probably get away with it too, if not for one small detail she'd overlooked. There's just one problem with your story, Mrs. Caldwell, I said, reaching slowly into my jacket pocket. We didn't come here alone. Her eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I mean Saul Panzer is in the next room with a recording device, capturing every word of this conversation, including your confession to 3 murders. It was a bluff, but a good one. Caldwell's eyes flicked toward the door. just enough hesitation for me to move. I dove sideways as she pulled the trigger, the bullet passing close enough to my ear that I could feel its wind. By the time she swung the gun toward Wolfe, I was already moving, hitting her low and hard enough to drive her back against the windows. The gun went off again, this time into the ceiling, showering us with plaster. Caldwell was stronger than... She looked, fighting like someone who had everything to lose and nothing left to hope for. But she was also 70 years old, and I was younger, bigger, and considerably more motivated. I got the gun away from her, just as the office door burst open, revealing Inspector Kramer and 2 uniformed officers with weapons drawn. Behind them came David Stern and Margaret Rothmore, both looking shocked but grimly satisfied. "That was faster than I expected," Kramer said, surveying the scene. "You were listening? Mr. Stern contacted me this morning with some interesting theories about Mrs. Caldwell's role in the murders. We've been monitoring her office since noon." Kramer gestured toward the woman now slumped in my grip. "Did she confess?" "To all 3. Murders, plus a $12 million theft from Holocaust survivors. The whole conversation's on tape." Eleanor Caldwell looked up at me with eyes that held no remorse, only the cold calculation of someone who'd spent decades turning other people's suffering into personal profit. "You have no idea what you've done," she said quietly. "This will destroy the bank, cost hundreds of jobs, ruin thousands of lives." "Maybe," I replied, "but it'll also return $12 million to the people it was stolen from. And make sure Charles Rothmore, Harrison Pembroke, and Jonathan Hartwell get the justice they deserve." "Justice." Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "They were all criminals, Mr. Goodwin. Rothmore was skimming from accounts, Pembroke was taking kickbacks, and Hartwell was a Nazi sympathizer who sold out Jewish refugees during the war. I was cleaning up their mess. By murdering them, by protecting the institution they were destroying with their greed and stupidity." She straightened her jacket with hands that barely trembled. "I've given my life to this bank, built it into something that matters. I wasn't going to let 3 corrupt men tear it down." Kramer stepped forward with handcuffs. "Eleanor Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murders of Charles Rothmore, Harrison Pembroke, and Jonathan Hartwell." As they led her away, I found myself thinking about the twisted logic that had driven her to murder. In her mind, she was the hero of the story, protecting jobs and preserving an institution while cleaning up other people's messes. The fact that she'd built her heroism on theft from genocide survivors apparently didn't factor into her moral calculations. "Quite a case," Wolfe said, as we watched the police cars disappear into Manhattan traffic. "Quite a woman. Grandmother. By day, cold-blooded killer by night. The most dangerous criminals often are those who believe their motives are pure." Wolfe turned toward the building entrance. "Come, Archie. I believe we're finished here." As we walked away from First Manhattan Trust, I reflected on the strange mixture of justice and tragedy that had marked this case from beginning to end. 3 men were dead, all of them flawed, all of them caught up in something larger and more corrupt than they'd initially understood. One woman would spend the rest of her life in prison for murders she'd convinced herself were justified. And somewhere in Europe, Holocaust survivors and their families would finally receive money that had been stolen from them decades ago. Not much in the grand scheme of their losses, but enough to matter, enough to make a difference in lives. Fadat had already endured too much hardship. "Justice is a complicated thing," I said as we settled into a taxi. "Indeed, but it's the only currency that ultimately matters." Wolfe was quiet for a moment, watching the city pass by outside the window. "Mrs. Caldwell was correct about one thing. Her exposure will harm innocent people. But some prices are worth paying, and some truths are worth telling regardless of their cost, even when the truth hurts people who don't deserve it. Especially then. Truth is like surgery, Archie. Painful but necessary for healing. The alternative is to let infection spread until it destroys everything." The case officially closed 3 weeks later, when Eleanor Caldwell pled guilty to 3 counts of murder and multiple counts of fraud and theft. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, noting that her crimes represented a profound betrayal of trust that strikes at the very foundation of civilized society. First Manhattan Trust survived the scandal, though barely. New management, new policies, and a very large donation to Holocaust survivor organizations helped restore some measure of public confidence. David Stern's organization recovered nearly 10 million of the stolen funds, money that was distributed to survivors and their families around the world. Margaret Rothmore used her husband's life insurance money to establish a foundation dedicated to investigating financial crimes against Holocaust survivors. She sent us a note saying Charles would have been proud to know his death led to justice for people who'd suffered far more than he ever had. As for Wolfe and me, we collected our fee and moved on to the next case. But this one stayed with me, longer than most. Maybe it was the scope of the crime, theft from people who'd already lost everything, or maybe it was the cold calculation behind Caldwell's murders. Or maybe it was just the reminder that evil often wears a respectable face and speaks in reasonable tones. But justice is what we do, even when it's complicated, even when it costs more than it pays, even when it requires us to confront truths that some people would prefer to keep buried. That's the choice we make every time someone knocks on our door with a story that doesn't add up, and money enough to make us listen. Sometimes I wonder whether the pursuit of truth is worth the pain it causes, whether justice for the dead justifies disruption for the living, whether one person's determination to uncover corruption is worth the chaos it brings to innocent lives. What do you think? Is absolute truth always preferable to comfortable lies? Can justice ever be too expensive to pursue? I'd love to hear your thoughts, whatever city you're watching from tonight. In the end, maybe that's all any of us can do. Tell the truth as we see it, pursue justice as we understand it, and hope that somewhere in the balance between chaos and order, between revelation and peace, we find something worth the effort it takes to get there. Charles Rothmore died trying to protect money that belonged to people who'd suffered more than most of us can imagine. That seems like a legacy worth preserving, whatever the cost.